So Wittgenstein's Tractatus. Huh. A book so challenging, even the guy who wrote it called it more art than philosophy. And we've even got excerpts from a brand new translation. You weren't kidding about a deep dive. Color me intrigued. Why is this text such a big deal?
Well, let me tell you, it's definitely not your typical philosophy.
Yeah, reading through the intro, it seems like.
Wittgenstein seemed to, how should I put it, almost enjoy how dense it is. Like some ideas, the really big ones, they can't just be explained away with words.
He was really into this whole showing versus telling thing, wasn't he?
Yeah, you could say that.
Even his own life story. I mean, talk about a plot twist. Born into wealth, starts studying engineering, then bam, decides to devote himself to philosophy and writes most of this Tractatus thing during World War I. You could practically feel that intensity when you read it.
Absolutely. I mean, his background, it really shapes how he thought about logic, about the limits of what we can even say about the world. And yeah, the fact that he's wrestling with these huge questions in the trenches during a war, it's got to have an impact.
Right, and speaking of impact, the sources mention Frege and Russell as big influences. Why are their names coming up in relation to Wittgenstein?
Okay, so we're talking about some heavy hitters in the world of logic and math here. Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell. These guys were trying to create like a perfect system of logic. Imagine being able to represent all of math, the whole shebang, with symbols and rules so precise that there's zero room for ambiguity.
That's a pretty ambitious goal.
Yeah.
Trying to pin down the universe with symbols.
And for a while, it seemed like they were onto something. But then they hit a bit of a snag. It's kind of a brain twister, to be honest. But basically, they stumbled upon this paradox.
A paradox. Okay, now you've got to elaborate. What kind of paradox can throw a wrench in a project that big?
So picture this, right? You're trying to categorize, I don't know, everything. And I mean everything in the universe.
I'm trying, yeah.
So you've got your category for all podcasts, right? Makes sense. And then you've got your category for everything that's not a podcast, right? Seems pretty straightforward.
Okay, I'm with you so far.
But then, what happens when you get to the category of all categories that don't contain themselves?
Okay, I see where this is going. This is like meta-categories.
Exactly. Does that category contain itself or not? If it doesn't, then by its own definition, it should. But if it does contain itself, then it shouldn't. It's a total mind-bender, a contradiction at the very core of how they were defining things.
So this paradox, it kind of blew a hole in their perfect logical system.
Big time. And this, my friend, is where Wittgenstein enters the scene. He was, you could say, captivated by this paradox, not just as a math problem to solve, but as a symptom of something much deeper, something fundamental about language itself.
He was bothered by a paradox. That seems, I don't know, a little abstract to get worked up over.
Well, yeah, on the surface it seems that way, but think about it. If we can't even talk about categories without running into these contradictions, what does that say about language itself? Like, what can we actually say with any certainty about the world? And those, my friend, are the questions that consumed him. That's what led him to write the Tractatus.
Yeah, those are some pretty big questions, and it sounds like we're about to get into some even bigger answers.
So the Tractatus, it's basically Wittgenstein's attempt to, draw a line in the sand, to show us what we can actually talk about and what's, outside the bounds of language.
From what you've said, it doesn't sound like he was afraid of a challenge, that's for sure. But how do you even begin to tackle a question that big? I will say, reading through the source material, the way the Tractatus is structured, it's something else.
Oh, yeah. No, it's incredibly precise, very structured, almost like, I don't know, a geometric proof or something. Each proposition, each statement he makes, it builds on the one before it, very carefully leading you through his line of thinking.
So it's not exactly a beach read. If you had to sum it up, like the main takeaway, the thing you really want someone to walk away with from the Tractatus, what would it be?
At its core, Wittgenstein's arguing that the world, it's made up of facts.
Right.
And language, when we use it right, it's like a mirror. It reflects those facts back at us.
Okay, I think I'm following. We see something happening in the world like a fact of reality, and then we use language to kind of describe it, yeah.
Right, but he takes it a step further. He says a sentence, it's only meaningful if it actually matches up with a possible fact in the world. And he calls these sentences, get this, propositions.
So if I were to say, this is a podcast about Ludwig Wittgenstein, that statement, it only makes sense because, well, here we are. This conversation, us talking about Wittgenstein, it's a real thing.
Bingo, you got it. But what really gets me is how this idea, which seems so simple when you put it like that, has huge implications for how we understand, well, anything really.
The source material, He keeps mentioning this picture theory. What is that all about? Is he literally saying that our sentences are like little paintings of facts?
In a way, yeah. Wittgenstein, he says that a proposition, it has a certain logical structure, and that structure, it mirrors the structure of the fact it's representing.
So not so much about actually looking like the thing, but about how the pieces fit together. More like a blueprint or a schematic, maybe?
Exactly. And just like a blueprint can be accurate or totally wrong, a proposition, a sentence, it can be true or false depending on whether it actually reflects what's happening in the world.
Makes sense. The text also talks about elementary propositions. Are those just like really simple sentences?
He thought that you could break language down into these basic units, like the atoms of meaning. And these elementary propositions, they would match up with the most basic, fundamental facts about the world. He even called those atomic facts.
So just like atoms can combine to create all these complex molecules, these elementary propositions, they're like the building blocks that make up the more, I don't know, elaborate sentences we use every day.
You're getting it. He was really trying to drill down to the foundation of things, trying to find the underlying structure of both language and reality. But here's where things get really, really interesting.
You said interesting about this book more than any other we've covered, I think.
Remember how Wittgenstein was wrestling with those limits of language? What we can even talk about? Well, he comes to this fascinating conclusion. There are some things that we just can't put into words. Things that go beyond facts and propositions. Things language can't quite grasp.
This is where that whole unsayable thing comes in, right?
You got it. He thought that some of the most profound things in life, stuff like ethics, beauty, the meaning of life, those things, you can't just capture them in a sentence. You can experience them, you can show them, but you can't just talk about them directly.
So if we try to talk about the meaning of life or whatever, basically, I don't know, babbling, should we just avoid talking about the big questions altogether then?
See, that's the million-dollar question, right? And it gets to why the Tractatus is still so relevant today. He's not saying that these things aren't important or that they're meaningless, not at all. In fact, he thought they were the most important things in life. He's just saying that we can't approach them the same way we do other stuff, like with logic and language. Like, it's not like discussing the weather report, you know?
It's like trying to describe what love feels like to someone who's never felt it. No matter what you say, the words, they're never going to be enough.
Exactly. You have to feel it to really get it. And that's kind of what Wittgenstein is getting at. He's not trying to shut down the conversation, but making us more aware of when our words, well, when they might be failing us.
I'm starting to see why this book ruffled so many feathers. He's not just giving us answers, he's making us rethink how we even ask the questions in the first place. So we've been talking about this idea that some of the biggest questions, the really big ones about what it all means, maybe we just can't answer them with words. It's kind of a mind-blowing concept when you really think about it. So how did people react to the Tractatus? Did they just give up and say, well, guess that's it, we're done here?
Oh, not even close. If anything, the Tractatus, it kind of threw a grenade into the world of philosophy, sparked all these debates, inspired whole new ways of thinking. It was a big deal.
Like what? What kind of impact did it have?
So one of the biggest movements to come out of it was this thing called logical positivism. Basically, they took Wittgenstein's ideas about the limits of language and kind of, well, ran with it.
So Wittgenstein says there's stuff we can't really talk about. And the logical positivists, they took that as a challenge.
Pretty much. They were like, okay, if a statement can't be verified, like scientifically proven or logically sound, then it's basically meaningless. Just like that.
Wow. Anything outside of science and logic was, what, just off limits? Seems like a pretty strict way to look at the world.
Oh, it was radical, for sure. And even within the movement, there were tons of arguments, people interpreting Wittgenstein in all sorts of ways. It's not like he gave them a rule book on how to be a logical positivist.
Right, because even understanding the Tractatus feels like an accomplishment. But what about Wittgenstein himself? Did he stick with these ideas?
Okay, so this is where it gets even more interesting. Get this.
Yeah.
He actually ends up disagreeing with himself later on.
Wait, he disagreed with himself? After all that work, all that careful thinking, he was just like, nah, never mind.
Pretty much. But that's what's so great about him. He was always questioning, always pushing the boundaries, even his own. In his later stuff, he's got a whole different take on language, focusing more on how it actually gets used, in context. Not so much about this underlying logical structure.
So instead of this universal language of reality, he's looking at how we use language, like in everyday life.
Exactly. He gets really interested in these language games, how the way we use words totally depends on the situation. Like, talking in a courtroom is way different from talking on a playground, right? It's all about function, not just form.
That makes his early work on the Tractatus even more impressive, I think. To build something that complex, that thought out, and then to turn around and question it all, that takes guts.
Totally. And that's why we're still talking about the Tractatus today, even 100 years later. It reminds us that it's okay to think big, even if we end up changing our minds later on.
Philosophy is a journey, not a destination.
You got it. And every deep dive like this one, it gets us a little closer, even if the answers aren't always clear.
You've definitely given me a lot to think about today. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that maybe the limits of our words are the limits of our world, but that doesn't mean we have to stop exploring.